Hello, this is Waldemar Januszczak, art critic, producer and presenter of documentaries. And thanks for watching Perspective, YouTube's home for classical art.
Here it is, the Van Gogh letter, £600,000 and 20, and 620,000. We'll offer me 650 and 620,000. 650 is here with Chris at 650, 680, 700,000. At £750,000. So, 910, thank you.
You've just seen a world record being set, £750,000. It's the most ever paid for a letter. It's a kind of madness, really, this mania for Van Gogh. He's our favourite artist. We spend millions on him, but we don't know that much about him. Not really. Yet the full story of Vincent van Gogh is a tale worth hearing.
Starry, starry night, paint your palette blue and grey. Look out on a summer's day with eyes that know
If you
the
want to witness
darkness
just
in my
how
soul,
dramatically the world has taken leave of its senses when it comes to Vincent van Gogh, I recommend a visit to his hometown of Zundert.
This is a famous flower festival they have here. And all these floats, made of millions and millions and millions of flowers, are dedicated to Vincent. Tens of thousands of people have turned up to see them. Now, I like flowers too, and the effort that's gone into creating these things is unimaginable. I mean, look at that. It's fantastic. But, unfortunately, all this has nothing, absolutely nothing, to do with the real Vincent van Gogh. Vincent would have hated it.
Van Gogh's father was the preacher here in Zundert, Pastor Theodorus van Gogh of the Dutch Reformed Church. If you look down from the pulpit, there's a little brass bowl. That's the font in which Vincent was christened in 1853. A noisy little boy with red hair, Vincent Willem van Gogh, the first of 6 children, all christened in this church, all by their own father. We're actually in Catholic Brabant, a tiny bit of Holland that pokes into Belgium. It's Belgium, really. So the Van Goghs were surrounded by Catholics. The Protestant community here is tiny. It kept them close. They were outcasts together, pioneers. That house behind me, the bright yellow one, that's the house Vincent grew up in. It's not the real one, of course. It's one they've recreated out of 500,000 dahlias. They like growing flowers here in Zundert. But he did actually live just a little bit up the road in that house there. That's been rebuilt too, but it stands in exactly the place that Vincent spent the first 16 years of his life. It's rather touching to be here. And something I didn't know, I didn't realise till I got here. He did an early drawing. There are about 12 of his early drawings left, and there's one of this rather strange architectural feature. It looks like a capital of a church or a bank or something, and no one really knew where it was, and I certainly didn't know where it was. Then you come here and you realise that actually it's a capital, the top of the town hall in Zundert, across the road. He must have sat there in his bedroom, looked straight out of the window and seen this pilaster in front of him. So what it actually is the first of the drawings that Vincent did of the view from his bedroom window, this funny little pilaster. And it's a habit he kept up all his life. Every room he ever stayed in, he would draw what's outside of it. And it began here, as everything did.
Starry, starry night, paint your palette blue and grey. Look out on a summer's day with eyes that know the darkness in my soul. Shadows on the hills,
Vincent had been deliberately named after his uncle, another Vincent van Gogh, a hugely successful art dealer whom everyone called Uncle Cent. When Vincent was 16, he was packed off to The Hague, where Uncle Cent had a gallery. He was going to be an art dealer too. Vincent had a special post created for him as an apprentice clerk at the Hague branch of Goupil & Co., the world's most prestigious art franchise, who'd merged with Uncle Cent. It was a behind-the-scenes job at first, dealing with Goupil's extensive international paperwork. Amazingly, Van Gogh turned out to be good at this and was soon promoted to front of shop.
Rich Hague clients would turn up here in their carriages. They'd be met by the teenage Vincent van Gogh, who'd escort Sir and Madam inside and commend them on their taste when Sir and Madam decided on their purchase. This is the 3-volume correspondence of Vincent to his brother Theo. It's the biggest, heaviest and most celebrated epistolic package in art. I've tackled it a couple of times now, and it took me several months each go.
Vincent's almost as famous for writing these letters as he is for painting the sunflowers. There's so much insight here into his creative thinking. But the very first letter was just a brief note about the weather, scribbled to Theo from The Hague in September 1872.
Theo was a couple of years younger than Vincent, but he also decided to become an art dealer while Vincent was here. They hoped one day they might work together. But on the 17th of March, 1873, a rather glum Vincent wrote to Theo to tell him that he was going to be moved.
It was another promotion. He'd done so well in The Hague that he was being sent to London. He was 20.
He arrived at Victoria Station on the 19th of May, 1873, and soon found some lodging somewhere in Battersea. He spoke decent English. It quickly improved. Within weeks, he was reading Keats. London came at him from all sides. It was the largest city in the world, and 4 million people had somehow squeezed themselves into it. Here's what it looked like. This is Gustave Doré's London, published just before Vincent got here. Look at the state of it. This is Ludgate Hill, looking up towards St. Paul's. Look at those crowds.
I've got a pal, a regular out and outer.
Vincent had a copy of this and treasured it. You might recognise this image as well. It's Newgate Prison. 2 decades later, he still hadn't forgotten it.
For 40 years, and it don't seem a day too much. There ain't.
Vincent described his first year in London as the happiest of his life. He went boating on the Thames, he visited the museums, the parks, but what really cheered him up was moving here, to 87 Hackford Road, Brixton, where Vincent had a room at the top that he loved. I don't need to tell you what Brixton is today. It's yardie country, dangerous. But it wasn't like that in Vincent's time. In 1873, this was a prosperous middle-class suburb. No one knew where Vincent lived in London until 1971, when a postman, a Van Gogh obsessive called Paul Chalcroft, tracked him down to this house. Chalcroft was on strike at the time, getting ready for the 3-day week with lots of hours on his hands. There's a Mrs. Smith living here now, and I imagine it was a heck of a surprise when the striking postman knocked on her door and told her that Van Gogh lived here. You must be Mrs. Smith.
Hello, good morning.
Do you know,
yes, I am.
I've read so much about you.
Really?
And about this house.
You're welcome.
Thank you. I really want to ask you, right?
Come through.
What was it like when the postman turned up, the striking postman?
Paul Chalcroft.
Paul
It was
Chalcroft.
very exciting, actually.
Is that one of his?
That's Van Gogh, and that's Paul Chalcroft too.
I mean, he was obsessed with Vincent,
He
wasn't he?
absolutely knew everything about Vincent from the day he was born to the day he went. In fact, his wife said to me, I don't know where to put all these pictures he's drawing of Van Gogh, she's driving me balmy. It's not a bit like it was when he was here.
Well, it must
Imagine
still
this-
be more or less the same. You've
No.
sort of fenced in the
Yes, the
stairs, haven't
yes, I did. This was the room he slept in.
you? This one here?
This one here, and the two windows. That's all the paintings in there.
There's the church at
Church,
Auvers.
and that's right. That's Paul Shercroft's work again.
And do you sleep here now, Mrs. Smith? Is this your bedroom?
Yes, it's my bedroom.
So you sleep in the room that Van Gogh slept in?
Yes, I do.
That must be quite exciting. I'd be excited.
I can't hear him snoring at all.
Lucky you.
No.
I bet he did.
His landlady, Mrs. Ursula Lawyer, ran a small school here. She also took lodgers. Vincent was working in Covent Garden at Goupil's London office, and every morning he walked to work in a top hat he'd bought specially. He thought it made him look more English. This journey to Covent Garden took him 45 minutes, and that's not easy.
The wandering minstrel eye, a thing of threads.
Van Gogh was a ridiculously fast walker. He shot past the Oval, where the English played that strange game called cricket. He didn't enjoy the fog, it depressed him. And the river, pumped full of sewage, used to stink so badly he hurried across it. But he loved this view over Westminster Bridge. The Houses of Parliament, just built. The Thames embankment, newly reclaimed from 32 acres of mud. And he couldn't have missed the poverty. You know that expression, slumming it? Well, slumming was something Londoners used to do in Vincent's time. It means going to look at the slums. The worst ones were in the East End, Whitechapel, Bethnal Green, terrifying places, underage prostitutes lurking in the alleys, and an unbuilt sewage system pumping crap into the streets. I know you won't believe this, but I really did that. It took me 53 minutes. That's 8 minutes more than Vincent. And he used to do it twice a day, strolling to work, strolling back. He worked just there at Goupil's, which is a noodle restaurant now. He was basically selling prints and earning £90 a year, which was actually a very good salary in those days, about 3 times the average payment for a labourer.
The wandering minstrel eye, a thing of threads and patches.
Van Gogh's favourite English writer was Dickens. He read most of the novels and then reread them. He was always quoting Dickens in his letters, gobbling up Dickens's sympathy for the London poor, all those blighted Oliver Twists scrounging in the streets. Dickens opened Vincent's eyes to modern human misery. Dickens died in 1870, just before Vincent got here. To commemorate his death, one of Vincent's favourite Victorian sentimentalists, Luke Fildes, produced an unforgettable image of Dickens's empty chair pushed away from his desk. Vincent bought this illustration and learned from it how an empty chair can stand in so poignantly for a missing person. Haunted by this image, Vincent went on to become the greatest painter of empty chairs there's ever been.
And to your hue is changing. I tune my subtle song. I tune my subtle song.
Vincent's landlady in Brixton, Mrs. Lawyer, had a daughter, Eugenie, who was 19, a year younger than Vincent. Perhaps the chief reason why he enjoyed his first year in London so much was because Eugenie was here. Vincent fell for her all the way. He was besotted. What's extraordinary is that he didn't tell her he was in love with her for almost a year. He kept it bottled up. He let it fester.
Vincent never said a word. When it finally came out, an amazed Eugenie informed him that she was already secretly engaged to a previous lodger, an engineer called Samuel Plowman. The effect on Vincent of this firm and terrible rejection was devastating. When Eugenie rejected him, Vincent did what many before him have done and will always do. He found religion. He didn't have to look very far. It was already there in his blood, his upbringing. He started reading the Bible at nights, puffing away at his pipe, coming home early from work. He'd go to Salvation Army meetings at Elephant and Castle, hang around the soup kitchens and the prayer halls, sinking ever deeper into a melancholy love stupor. His work was now going so badly that his bosses decided to transfer him again to Paris. This is the old Goupil headquarters in Paris, where Vincent was made head of pictures. He didn't deserve it, so it can only have been intended as a deliberate confidence booster. It's for sale now. It's been turned into a loft.
So you're coming in the Gallery Goupil.
As head of pictures, Vincent was the chief salesman here. The way it was supposed to work was that Vincent would greet the rich clients, commend them on their taste, and sell them the most expensive stuff on the walls. Simple, but it didn't work out like that. The new religious Vincent chose instead to question their taste, argue with them, and suggest they buy some proper landscapes instead of the salon nonsenses that were hanging all around them here. It was actually a fascinating time in the Parisian art world. A few months before Vincent was transferred here, a bunch of disaffected artistic rebels, whom cruel critics had dubbed the Impressionists, had opened and closed their first show. But Vincent was too immersed in his new obsession with the Bible to take any notice of them whatsoever. Vincent had found a room up here in Montmartre. Montmartre means the Hill of Martyrs, and a martyr is definitely what he now fancied himself to be. He spent every evening up in that little room, reading the Bible and praying feverishly. "Get rid of all your books," he wrote to Theo, "and keep only the Bible." Goupil employees were expected to work over Christmas. It was the busiest selling period of the year. But without telling anybody, Vincent bunked off at Christmas that year and spent it in Holland with his family. When he returned to Paris, he was summoned into the boss's office and asked to resign. Okay, merci.
Merci.
Goupils gave him 3 months' notice, which was generous of them. Vincent had been reading the English papers in Paris, looking through the classifieds for a job. He eventually found one here in Ramsgate, teaching French, German, arithmetic and dictation to young boys at a school opened in this building by a Mr. William Stokes. This job was unpaid, just board and lodging, but he was teaching, and that pressed Vincent's vocational buzzer. The school was crummy, Dickensian one might say. The floors of the bedroom in which the boys slept were rotten, the windows broken. And Vincent complained desperately about the bed bugs. He did a couple of drawings out of the school window of this view. They're rather delightful. Stokes turned out to be entirely unreliable. Just 2 months after he got here, Vincent learned that the school was closing and moving to Isleworth,
a London suburb where Stokes promised Vincent a proper job. Vincent decided to walk there and to visit his sister on the way, who was teaching in Welwyn, a mere 100 miles away. Vincent got there in 3 days.
I've got a pal, a regular out and outer. She's a dear old girl. Oh, I'll tell you all about her.
This walking business wasn't just a case of saving on rail fares. He was driven to do it by the religious mania that was growing in him. He'd been reading Pilgrim's Progress by John Bunyan. It affected him immediately. He wasn't a penniless Dutch teacher walking to see his sister. He was a humble pilgrim making his difficult way in life. It's a feeling Vincent never lost.
And did any man ever show as much affection for his trusty boots as Vincent, years later, went on to show?
A lady living in the land that I'd swap for my dear old Dutch. There ain't a lady living in the land that I'd swap for my dear old Dutch.
Stokes' school in Isleworth turned out to be another no-hoper. But just down the Twickenham Road was another boys' school run by the Reverend Thomas Slade Jones, a congregational minister, the first man ever to understand fully Vincent's religious passion. The Reverend was one of the few heroes of Vincent's life. He gave him a job at this school and paid him. It was in this house that Vincent's frantic Bible reading and growing religious mania finally found an outlet. He decided he wanted to be some sort of missionary. Teaching wasn't enough for him. He thought about going up north to work among the poor in the dark satanic mills. But there was quite enough poverty to be getting on with in London, where a man with a religious mission could find plenty to do.
These are the minute books of the Turnham Green Congregational Church for 1876, and look who's in them, named as a new church worker, an assistant preacher, Mr. Van Gogh. Look at the spelling, it's wrong. That's why he began calling himself Vincent. He was fed up with the English getting his name wrong. As Mr. Richardson proposed, Mr. Stembridge seconded that Mr. Vincent van Gogh, spelt G-O-F, be accepted as a co-worker.
The Reverend Slade Jones, pestered mightily, one imagines, by Mr. Van Gogh, and boy could Mr. Van Gogh pester, was finally persuaded to allow Vincent to step across that crucial religious divide that separates the sheep from the shepherds. On the 29th of October, 1876, on a sunny autumn Sunday, Vincent rose before the faithful at the Richmond Methodist Chapel in suburban West London and delivered his first sermon. We still have it. We know exactly what he said to his first congregation. It's an old belief and a good belief that our life is a pilgrim's progress, that we are strangers on the earth, but that it's long, well-meaning, repetitive, boring. Every few sentences, it resorts to thick bundles of biblical quotation and would have left many of us dozing in the aisles. The most impressive thing about it for me is that it's in English, a language he'd mastered so quickly. He must have had help writing it, perhaps from the Reverend Slade Jones. On the road walks a pilgrim, staff in hand. He's been walking for a good long while. Since none of us has time to listen to it all, let me tell you that its main theme was pilgrimage. Life is tough, the road is long, but faith in God will see us through. And it all feels sneakily autobiographical.
Further ahead in our story, after some turbulent religious times, the preacher who stood up here and delivered his first sermon was to give up religion rather fiercely and claim to despise it. But one of the keys to understanding the real Van Gogh is to realise that once all this has soaked into his art, it could never be removed. Never.
That Christmas, Vincent went home to his family. He said he'd return to London after the holidays, but he never did. Whatever promises he'd made to his new flock in England, his family forced him to break. Instead of returning to Isleworth after Christmas, Vincent was packed off to this cute little town, Dordrecht, where his family had come up with a new calling for him. He was going to be a bookseller. His boss was to be a Mr. Braat, and the bookshop stood right there where that cafe is. Actually, I can easily imagine Vincent as an eccentric book dealer. His family always remembered him with his nose stuck in a book, and later he'd go on to paint books with such love and excitement. It didn't matter how humble a book was, Vincent's art always stressed its preciousness. The booksellers I know tend to be scruffy, cranky, unwashed types, lost in their own world, just like Vincent. He would sit in the corner wearing his English top hat, ignoring the customers, as booksellers do, and busying himself with the remarkable task he'd set himself here in Dordrecht. Vincent, remember, spoke 4 languages fluently, and he decided to produce a translation of the Bible in all of them simultaneously: Dutch, French, German and English. He divided his paper into 4 columns and inched his way through the Bible in 4 languages at once. This is a painting he did some years later of his father's Bible. It's still being used in Zundert. The book-selling job didn't work out, of course. Vincent was still determined to join the church, like his father and his grandfather. Amsterdam University had a 6-year theology course, and Pastor Theodorus fixed it for his son to get on it, providing he passed some exams in Latin and Greek. Vincent, alas, turned out to be unusually hopeless at both of them. Something unsettling happened here in Amsterdam, something I find disturbing. If Vincent's studies weren't going well, he used to punish himself by picking up a cudgel and beating himself across the back until he bled. And on particularly cold nights, he used to come home late, deliberately, so that the door to this house would be locked, and he'd be forced to spend the night outside, shivering. These were weird habits, and perhaps they were habits he never lost. Vincent never made it onto the theology course. He dropped out. The only religious calling still open to someone as unqualified as him was to become a missionary, the lowest of the low. A place called Laken in Belgium had a training school for evangelists, which he failed to get into, of course. But a kindly teacher at this school, the Reverend Peterson, remember that name, liked something about him and arranged for Vincent to be given a trial period, ministering to the miners in the notorious Borinage. The Borinage's geographic nickname hereabouts is the Black Earth Country. It's a bleak industrial stretch of slag heaps and mine workings straddling the border between France and Belgium, spoiling the land on both sides. He'd looked up the Borinage in an encyclopedia, and this encyclopedia informed him that this was a happy working community, populated by a race of friendly miners who descended into the earth every day, content in the knowledge that they were being useful and serving God. But that's in the encyclopedia. In real life, the Borinage was hell on earth. And while the mine owners back in Brussels were coining it, the poor sods stuck here were leading some of the grimmest lives available to man in so-called civilized Europe.
Vincent's duties as a preacher were twofold. Here in Wham, where he lodged in the interesting pink house behind me, there was also a converted dance hall that was used as a makeshift Protestant chapel. Vincent preached there to the few miners who turned up and their families, and he'd deliver his notoriously long sermons. He would also do the rounds of the miners' houses and conduct Bible classes there, communal gospel read-ins. Thus he found out exactly how the miners were living, and it appalled him.
There's a trait we need to keep an eye on with Vincent. It's a powerful urge, a recurring one, to hurt himself. He wanted to do more with the miners than just conduct their Bible classes. He needed also to share their misery. So he began giving away his food and his clothes too, starving himself, shivering in the cold, just like them. He even stopped washing so that he too, like the miners, was stained a permanent black. Now in this community, grim though it was, the preacher was still someone you looked up to. Mrs. Denis, the landlady of the house here, complained about him not washing. "Oh, Esther," he replied, "don't worry about the details. They don't matter in heaven." Vincent persuaded one of the older miners to take him down into a pit, and he described the experience in a particularly evocative letter to Theo. Down in the mine shaft, the diggings were arranged like a beehive, with one cramped chamber next to another, inside each of which a pathetic black figure would be picking away at the walls. Pick, pick, pick. Vincent was surprised to find horses down here, tragic beasts fated to spend their days trudging backwards and forwards, pulling the carts. There were 8-year-old kids as well, small enough to squeeze into any hole. I was wondering why missionaries were being sent to the Borinage at all. I mean, it's hardly the deepest Congo, and Brussels is only a few hours away. I found the answer here, in Germinal by Émile Zola. It's the finest mining novel ever written, and it's set on the French side of the Borinage. Read page 45, and you'll see that there were women down here too. With their smaller bodies, they too could squeeze into tighter spaces. But it was hot, and they didn't wear much. Zola describes how a miner, coming around a dark corner, encountered the immensely tempting sight of one of these young girls, down on her hands and knees, with her back to him. I won't go on. But this is why they sent the missionaries to the Borinage, to preach against promiscuity and sin. And it's true, every slither of symbolism you encounter in these mines feels satanic and hellish. Remember, Vincent was on trial here. His appointment as a preacher was temporary. He wanted it renewed, but it depended on his performance. After he'd been here about 6 months, they sent someone down from Brussels to inspect him. The Reverend Roche-Dieu was his name. Roche-Dieu in French means the rock of God, a terrifying name.
And this terrifying Roche-Dieu discovered Vincent starving, filthy, unkempt, manically identifying with the miners, and recommended that he be sacked. Vincent's example, reported Roche-Dieu, was a bad one. Vincent was devastated, absolutely devastated. He'd already been brutally rejected in love, and now the church, to which he'd given so much, was also rejecting him. As soon as he'd shaken out some of the shock, he set off on another of his absurd walks, this time all the way to Brussels. It took him over a week, and he cornered one of his old superiors from Laeken, the kindly Reverend Peterson. And for some unknowable, instinctive, curious reason, Vincent took with him to Brussels a batch of the drawings he'd been making of the Borinage miners. They looked as if they'd been scrawled out of crude black bits of the Borinage itself, raw, clumsy. He's already 27 and he has the drawing skills of a child. But Reverend Peterson saw something here and encouraged Vincent to go on. And there is something, isn't there? Thank God, say I, for the kindly Reverend Peterson, because without him, Vincent might still be in two minds today about his true calling. He came back here to the Borinage and prevaricated some more for a whole year. But finally, in this lonely little miner's house in which he'd holed up, Vincent van Gogh concluded he should be an artist. Hallelujah. He knew at last what he wanted to become, but he couldn't do it here. There was no art here to set him an example. He knew that he had to get back to what he called the land of pictures, and after 2 years in the Borinage, he decided abruptly to return to Brussels. We can't show you the little room above a cafe into which Vincent moved in Brussels when he turned up here in October 1880. It's been modernised into a railway bridge. But I can show you something better than that. I can show you this. It's a self-help book for artists, published originally in the 1860s by Charles Bargue. Vincent would have known it from his days as an art dealer, and now here in Brussels, he began dutifully to work his way through it. The idea with Bargue is that you copy one page after another, learning as you go. It's a mechanical slog. It wouldn't suit everyone, but it suited Vincent. He was, as we'll be seeing throughout the artistic helter-skelter ride that now lies ahead of us, an instinctive copyist. He stayed in Brussels for over 6 months. Everyone advised him to join the Academy of Arts up the road from here, but Vincent was reluctant. He knew what he was like in classroom situations. This was his academy. But you'll be wondering how this failed preacher with a talent for self-flagellation paid his way in Brussels. It's not a city where a little goes a long way. The small room above the cafe was 50 francs a month. There was food to buy, materials. The fact is that Vincent's father was still sending him money. It's not very impressive, is it? 27 years old and still scrounging off his parents. Pastor Theodorus was sending him 60 francs a month. And then suddenly, for no obvious reason, this went up to 100 francs. It was only later that Vincent found out the extra 40 francs were coming from his brother, Theo. Theo had been in Paris for 2 years working as an art dealer and making quite a name for himself. And Theo was perhaps the only man on God's earth who welcomed Vincent's decision to become an artist. As soon as that decision was made, he began sending Vincent money, and would continue to do so for the rest of Vincent's life. This is Etten, a Dutch village in Brabant that was once so pretty. See this car park? That's where the Van Goghs used to live. Vincent's left us such a sweet drawing of his father's parsonage. It breaks my heart to look at it. Pastor Theodorus had been moved here, just up the road from Zundert, and in 1881, Vincent turned up for inglorious and obvious reasons. He was broke and needed once again to scrounge from his family now that he'd decided to become an artist. And there's a cycle route you can go on now that takes you through some of the places he drew as he launched his great struggle to conquer the pencil. I'm wobbling round it in the company of a local Van Gogh historian, Martin Monden, and he knows everything there is to know about Van Gogh in Etten. So this is a famous tree. This is the tree that Vincent drew when he was in Etten.
Yeah, that's right. It was called the orchard, and we call in Etten the mother tree. That means it is about close to 350 years old.
When Vincent came here after the Borinage, this difficult time he had amongst the miners in Belgium, this was really the first place where he was determined to be an artist, isn't it, Etten?
Yeah.
Very important.
Well, he made a lot of drawings, 316, and he was here till December 1881.
So Martin,
Yeah, Waldemar.
I recognise that view. That's the two towers, yeah?
Yeah, that's the two towers with the drawing by Van Gogh. Two towers, the landscape is the rising thunderstorm, you know.
It's a roundabout now.
Yes, now a roundabout with sunflowers.
This would have been the place that before was full of what? Fields, people digging, labourers' cottages, yeah?
That's right. It was a very small, narrow street with on both sides small houses and farmer houses, and the diggers were living here, which were drawn by Van Gogh.
There's some of it, I think, some of his most beautiful drawings here were the drawings of people working.
Yeah, that's
there's the man by the fire, but there's also the diggers, people gathering potatoes.
Yeah.
And they're all done around here in this area.
Well, they're all around here, yes.
I recognise his father's church, of course, that's the one on the right.
Yeah, that's right. The right-hand church, and that's the Christian Reformed Church.
At least it hasn't changed very much.
No.
Everything else has, hasn't it,
And,
in Etten?
it is the same like 120 years ago, only the parsonage is gone.
And the roundabout has come.
And the roundabout is coming, yes.
Okay.
That's right.
Something horrible happened to Vincent here in Etten. His cousin, Kay Voss, a widow with a baby boy, came to spend the summer in the parsonage, and Vincent inevitably fell in love with her. Women in black, widows, were a weakness of his. When Vincent could no longer contain his passion for Kay and blurted out how he felt about her, she dealt him and his love of widows a mortal blow. "No, no, never," she replied, words he couldn't forget and kept quoting. "No, no, never." Stupidly, Vincent took this as a maybe. So he followed her to Amsterdam, pushed his way into her house, but she wasn't there. She was hiding from him. So he put his hand into a flame and told her family he'd keep it there unless he saw her. Her uncle just stood up and blew the flame out. It was a ridiculous but critical event. His parents were appalled at his behaviour, everybody was, but Vincent couldn't see what he'd done wrong. Was loving someone too much a crime? Years later, when he was in Arles with Gauguin, Vincent painted a mysterious picture called Memory of the Garden in Etten. It shows a pair of widows. One is his mother, and he always said that the other was his sister Wilhelmina. But doesn't she look like the spitting image of Kay Voss? "No, no, never," she said. How it must have hurt.
With your long black hair and your eyes are blue, the only thing I ever get from you is sound.
You know, Vincent's life was peppered with lousy Christmases. when he hacked off his ear at the other end of this story, that was at Christmas. And the one he had in Eton in 1881 was another of the very worst. He stormed out on Christmas Day itself, refused to go to church, and left immediately for here, The Hague. There, he must have trawled the red light district, or perhaps visited an address he already knew, where he sought out a prostitute called Christine Klaasina Maria Hornik, who, for some complex Dutch linguistic reason, was called Sien. Vincent seems already to have known this Sien. How else to explain the extreme abruptness with which he took up with her? Before Christmas, Kay Voss was his life, his destiny, his everything. After Christmas, he's with Sien and wants to marry her, from one to the other in a week. Sien was a few years older than him, and as people are fond of pointing out, she was no beauty. Pockmarked with smallpox, she had a shrewish face and looked used, discarded. Sien already had a 5-year-old daughter. She'd had 2 miscarriages and was pregnant again when Vincent met her. She would later have that baby whilst they were living together. So life had dealt her one crappy hand after another and wrinkled her prematurely. But these wrinkles attracted Vincent every bit as fiercely as some men are attracted by long legs or fluttering eyelashes. He liked his women faded. She was bad-tempered, but he forgave her that. She swore crazily, but he forgave her that. She drank, she smoked, he forgave all of it, because, unlike the rest of them, she stayed with him. The woman is as attached to me as a tame dove, he wrote, so pleased. Sien is the only woman Van Gogh ever lived with. They set up house in the street behind me, here in the Hague outskirts, where it used to be cheaper and the trains keep you awake at night.
With your long blonde hair and your eyes of blue, the only
Vincent's best drawing so far, his first masterpiece, was of Sien. He gave it an English title,
Sorrow.
Sorrow.
You're acting
He wanted her to look like a root, he said, clinging to the earth for survival, and she does.
High-class games of sorrow. Sorrow.
It was all looking so good. He had a woman, he was set. This is where the hospital stood in which Vincent van Gogh was treated for the clap in the summer of 1882. For some reason, there's no plaque. He'd caught gonorrhea, and he's left us a detailed description of the treatment he received. A catheter would be inserted into his bladder through you-know-where and gradually enlarged. Because that's what happens to men who consort with prostitutes in The Hague.
With your long blonde hair and your eyes of blue, the only thing I ever got from you was sorrow. Sorrow.
When we left you in Programme 1, Vincent had set up house here with a prostitute called Sien.
Out there playing your high-class games of sorrow.
Sien had 2 children, and the gossips of The Hague were suggesting that the youngest was Vincent's.
You never do what you know you ought to.
This is the beach at Scheveningen. It's on the seaside outskirts of The Hague. And in Vincent's time, Hague artists used to troop out here for the day to draw the wild seas and the undulating dunes. Vincent would stay the night here with Sien. So bohemian, he bragged. They'd sleep together on the dunes, and in the morning they'd drink hot coffee together and watch the sun going up
and then Vincent would get down to work.
Vincent sent his brother Theo a drawing of himself using a contraption called a perspective frame here on the beach at Scheveningen. He'd had it built for him by the carpenter whose workshop was round the back of Vincent's studio. You can see this carpenter's workshop quite clearly in the most luminous of the Hague watercolours.
So it was all going so well. He had a woman, a studio, the pictures were pouring out of him when suddenly bad luck sniffed him out again. Someone discovered he was living with a prostitute. This someone was almost certainly his old boss from Goupil's in The Hague, Mr. Terstig. Terstig wrote to Vincent's father, who responded by trying to have his son committed in a lunatic asylum.
It was nearby, a place called Heel. I've been there, and it's not somewhere a father should seek to lock up a son. In any case, it proved unnecessary. Vincent had pledged to marry Scene and never ever to desert her. But after a year of getting to know her, he changed his mind.
It's impossible to know exactly what went wrong between them. Scene's mother certainly played a part. She was now living in the house with them, and since she was the one who originally sent Scene out onto the streets, she can't have been a good influence or a welcome presence.
I found Vincent's changing attitudes to Scene hugely disappointing. I didn't expect this fickleness from him. One moment, she's his saviour, his soulmate, the only one. Then suddenly, she's become that woman. Lazy, bad-tempered, stupid. Theo did his part. He was now sending Vincent 150 francs a month, and not unnaturally resented his brother keeping a prostitute and her family on his money. Theo wanted Vincent to leave the woman, leave The Hague, smarten up and concentrate on his art. And the usually headstrong Vincent found some unexpected meekness within him and came round to the idea. But before we too flee The Hague and head back into the Dutch countryside, as Vincent did, I want to pay tribute to Christine Klaasina Maria Hornig, whom everyone called Scene.
With your long blonde hair and your eyes of blue, the only thing I ever got from you was sorrow.
Maybe she drank, maybe she was a prostitute,
Sorrow.
maybe she was lazy. But she stuck
You're
with Vincent
acting
for a
funny,
year,
tried to
inspired his
spend
best
my
art so
money
far,
out
and deserved
there
better from him
playing your
than she
high-class
got.
games of sorrow. Sorrow.
We're northeast of Amsterdam, just about as far as you can go in Holland before you drop into the North Sea. This is Drenthe. With its sodden bogs and sunken fens, this is and was one of the poorest bits of the Netherlands. People scratched a living here digging peat and picking potatoes, and because it was so grim and damp and melancholy, Drenthe was cheap to live in. So this is where Vincent fled from The Hague, and how well this melancholy landscape suited his mood. The people lived like troglodytes, half above ground, half below, in lumpy, humpy cottages with moss roofs. Ghostly barges, loaded with shadowy black baggage, floated gloomily across the vistas. Vincent was here for about 3 months. He was in an awful state when he got here, having decided to desert Scene and the children. He tormented himself with it daily. When he encountered a stooped mother working in the fields or a bundled-up wife trudging along the paths, she reminded him invariably of Scene and made him feel tearful. Well, maybe. but he abandoned her nevertheless. Van Gogh wrote some of his longest and most philosophical letters from Drenthe. He obviously had a lot of time on his hands in the evenings, and I guess, looking around at all this, there wasn't much else to do. Vincent wrote to his parents as well about how the sunny autumn days in Drenthe alternated with stormy, wet ones. He preferred the storms, he said. He liked rain, and I don't think anyone's ever painted it as fondly or as often as he did. All Vincent's early work is glum. Working people, digging, bending, ploughing again and again in their endless toil. None of it's cheerful, but by general repute, the grimmest work he ever produced was here in Drenthe. But you know what? He never complained about the landscape or demeaned it. He always found it inspirational. To you and me, we get in a place like this and all we see are melancholy browns. But when you look at Vincent's pictures from Drenthe, there's so much radiance in them, so much colour. I think it's one of his greatest talents. Where everyone else saw heartbreak and bleakness, Vincent van Gogh found beauty. In the end, it wasn't the bleakness of Drenthe that drove him out of here, but the lack of money. Theo was having problems at work. With the risk of Theo losing his job, the only place left for Vincent to go was back into the arms of his family.
Wanneer je de wereld eens goed hebt bekeken, je hebt al wat moois gezien. Dan weet je meteen dat hier in Nederland verweg het best is en schoon bovendien.
Newnan, what a ghastly place. So neat, so pretty. But when Vincent turned up here, a few weeks before Christmas, 1883, this was somewhere notoriously bleak, right in the middle of the Dutch poverty belt. It's difficult these days to think of the Dutch as impoverished peasants, toiling in the fields from morning till night, digging potatoes, dying young. What a makeover they've had. But Vincent's art from Newnan is compelling evidence of just how dark and tragic and miserable and exhausting life was right here. His parents weren't pleased to see him. The affair with the whore in The Hague had upset them mightily. He told Theo that they shrank from letting him in, as if he were a big shaggy dog who'd leave muddy footprints in the living room. This is the house they lived in. Look at it, it's splendid. Vincent's behaviour was at its uncompromising worst. At dinner, he'd refused to join the rest of the family and sat apart on his own chair with his food in his lap, eating old bread crusts and cheese, which he'd have trouble chewing because his teeth were going. When they'd got over the shock of him turning up, they allowed him to clean out the mangle room at the back of the house, where the washing was done. Vincent put in a stove, he bought a few bits of modest furniture, and was soon working furiously in his first ever studio. Newnan specialised in two types of rural poverty, farming and weaving. Vincent's pictures of weavers are perhaps his most original early works. They're such strange and awkward machines, these black monsters of grimy wood, as he called them, in the middle of which sit, and I'm quoting him again, dark monkeys or gnomes or ghosts, clattering away with the sticks from morning until night. quarter of Newnham's battered working population used to be linen weavers, and now there's just one weaver's house left in the entire town. It's become a new age shop selling occult and religious knickknacks, but when you walk in, it's still eloquently tiny and easy to imagine how little room there would have been in here for the people once the black mechanical monster was installed and chattering. He'd begun collecting people as well, with this same pictorial greed, painting peasant heads time and time again. At least 50 of these face paintings still exist, and who knows how many more have been lost. It was almost like a scientific collection of peasant specimens. He'd got interested in phrenology, that disquieting pseudoscience that was terribly fashionable in the middle of the 19th century, and whose followers believed that you could tell a person's character from the shape of their head. Phrenology was the dodgy precursor of some truly terrible ideas. The racial stereotyping of the Nazis, for one, had phrenology as its original inspiration. It's utterly discredited now, but not then, and Vincent was interested in it. In his paintings of the peasants, he often distorts the physiognomies of the Newnham people to give them animal characteristics, snout-like noses, sloping foreheads, not to denigrate them, I'm sure, but to categorise them, a touch spookily perhaps, into rural types. The culmination of Vincent's manic investigation of country faces was the most ambitious painting of his Dutch years, the dark and entirely melancholy Potato Eaters. Vincent's father, Pastor Theodorus, died in March 1885, and he's buried here, on the spot where that tower used to stand that you see in the background of so many of Vincent's Newnham pictures. They weren't really speaking by then, they'd fallen out. But I don't think there's any doubt that the darkness of this event infected the picture that Vincent began a few days later. The Potato Eaters shows a family of knobbly Newnham peasants sharing their evening meal. Potatoes with coffee. Tomorrow, for a change, they might have coffee with potatoes. Vincent was inordinately proud of this painting. He considered it his masterpiece so far. It's endearingly clumsy and very him. It's potato heaven around here. They're everywhere. Potatoes, 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 potatoes. But they're not just the staple food of the peasants. There's more to it than that. Vincent said when he was painting the Potato Eaters that he wanted them to feel like potatoes. The people themselves, they had hands like potatoes. They had faces like potatoes. To be honest, I never quite knew what he meant by any of that till I got here and felt these things. The people are indeed like that. They're of the earth. They're gnarled. They're brown. They're like potatoes. Once you get out of Newnham, the landscape hasn't changed that much, with these plunging avenues of poplars that he so loved to paint. And Vincent had a peculiar outdoor hobby. He used to collect birds' nests, and apparently had about 30 of them, all different, while he was actually here. And he used to display them in a line, arranged on a decorative branch. Some of the nests came from rare birds, including, I was sad to see, the nest of a golden oriole. Why paint birds' nests? They're so difficult. I rather disapprove of Vincent collecting birds' nests. He took the eggs as well. There is this ruthlessness to him that we tend to overlook. We've become so mushy on the subject of Vincent van Gogh. Later on, when he was already at the insane asylum in Saint-Remy, he painted this beautiful study of an emperor moth. He said it had turned up in the asylum gardens at night and that he'd had to kill it to see it properly. That's meant to be Vincent going to work in the fields. He would have hated it. It's so twee. These days, Newnan is ever so proud of the fact that Van Gogh lived here for 2 years, produced some of his most powerful early works here. They love Vincent all right now, but they didn't when he was here. One of the girls from the Potato Eaters got pregnant. They said Vincent was responsible. And a Catholic priest from that church over there forbade his parishioners from posing for him. The town campaigned against him. Kids began throwing stones at him. They ran him out of town, so now they're milking him for all he's worth. That's not true of his next location, one of the world's most cosmopolitan cities. In November 1885, just in time to avoid the dreaded Christmas get-together of the Van Goghs, Vincent left for Antwerp. Antwerp's only 25 miles or so from where Vincent was born in Zundert, so although it's in Belgium, it was always geographically on Vincent's doorstep. But symbolically, this throbbing Brabantine metropolis, famous for art and beer and diamonds, was another world. In Antwerp, the priests didn't take to their pulpits whenever someone got pregnant because they would have had to stay up there all the time. The first place he explored was down here, the port. Typical Vincent. This was where Antwerp's low life was concentrated. Wandering through these streets in the rain, he saw a sailor being chased out of a brothel by a gang of angry prostitutes, which amused him. He was out of Newnan all right, after 2 years of grim country living, being treated as the village idiot. This was the urban shot, the complete change he needed. From now on, Vincent was an exile, a man on the move, and he never went back to Holland. The whores and the cafe girls were the only models he could get. He painted their portraits and paid them for it. What he really wanted was to paint them nude, but he couldn't afford it. He was living on bread and coffee from the time he moved out of his parents' house in Newnan to his first winter here, which is over half a year. He'd only eaten 6 or 7 hot meals. Vincent was literally starving.
Armand Jules Cabernet.
And some interesting evidence has emerged quite recently that Vincent was treated here, in this house, by a Dr. Cabernet for syphilis. Not only was syphilis fatal, it also drove you mad. The insane asylums of the 1880s were full of syphilitic lunatics. Vincent's doubts about his own sanity had good reason to increase. His teeth had gone. He went to the dentist here in Antwerp and had to have 10 teeth pulled out. If you've ever wondered why Vincent never smiles in any of his self-portraits, it isn't just that he's not the smiling kind, it's also because he doesn't want you to see his teeth. He was only 33 and already he was falling apart. He knew he was smoking too much, but he did it deliberately to subdue his hunger. And with a grim sense of humour that's untypical of Vincent, although it is admittedly rather Belgian, he painted what I think should be seen as a comic self-portrait. A skull with a fag in its mouth. Vincent, only 33, yet already facing death with a smile. Vincent joined the academy here in January 1886. He'd already been in Antwerp a couple of months and was, of course, a lifelong mistruster of academies. The
The trouble with academies, Vincent wrote to Theo from Newnan in the summer, is that they teach you to paint Louis XV and Arabs, but not weavers or diggers or sewers. Vincent loathed academies, and at the age of 33, he was singularly ill-suited to entering one. But the Academy in Antwerp was the only place he could get free models, particularly nude ones. Another student, Vincent Hageman, has left us some delightful memories of Vincent's time here. He wore a blue smock of a kind usually favoured by Flemish livestock merchants, and his fur hat, of course. Hageman remembers a cast of the Venus de Milo being brought in, and Vincent drawing her with great big hips. The aghast professor picked up this drawing and covered it with corrections, slimming down the new childbearing hips of the Venus de Milo. Vincent exploded. "You clearly don't know what a young woman's like," he bellowed. "A woman must have hips, buttocks, a pelvis that can carry a child," and out he stormed. The Academy Board met in March 1886 and decided unanimously that Vincent should be put back to the elementary class. But they were too late. He'd already gone. On the 20th of February 1886, Theo van Gogh was at work at Goupil, Boussod and Valadon, just here in the Boulevard Montmartre, when a porter from the Gare du Nord arrived with a note. Unfortunately, it was from Vincent. I say unfortunately because Theo had been pleading with Vincent not to give up his studies in Antwerp, not to come to Paris. Theo had troubles at work, he had troubles with his health, troubles with his mistress, and his flat was too small. But all this pleading made no difference. Vincent came anyway. Theo's apartment was far too small for both of them, so the brothers moved here, to the Rue Lapique, a notably steep road up which you must puff to enter Montmartre. You don't need me to tell you about Montmartre in Vincent's time. You've seen the film, attempted the Can-Can. This was Paris's chief nocturnal pleasure ground, busy with dance halls, drinking dens and cabarets, a shameful hill of fun that marked the edges of civilized Paris. Van Gogh's stay in Paris is surprisingly mysterious. He wasn't writing to Theo, obviously, because Theo was here, so there's a huge gap in their correspondence. There are bits and pieces of testimony from other Parisian artists, but it tends to feel unreliable and boozy. Let's try and put this in context. When Vincent arrived in Paris in the winter of 1886, Impressionism had been the art fashion for a decade already, and the hunt was on for the next big thing. But Vincent had never even seen an Impressionist painting. There were no Impressionist pictures in Newnan, there were no Impressionist pictures in Antwerp, so he had an awful lot of catching up to do. A couple of Vincent's first Parisian landscapes look out towards the city that way, but most of them don't. Most look deliberately that way. Back there, on the slopes of the Butte Montmartre,
you could still find a curious half-rural scrubland of overgrown allotments and pocket-sized urban vineyards. And Vincent's first paintings of the half-rural Montmartre may be stylistically undecided and a touch hesitant, but they do give you a strong sense of the bleak character of the scrubland. Lots of people's dreams were broken here, not just Vincent's. Was complaining to anyone who would listen about the state of the apartment. There were wet paintings propped up in every corner, clothes everywhere, and all this stuff that Vincent had picked up on his walks around Montmartre. It was a disastrous domestic arrangement. Did Vincent ever screw the top back on the toothpaste tube? I doubt it. Worse even than Vincent's chronic untidiness was his genius for picking quarrels with anyone over everything. There are these touching letters from Theo back to the family in Holland in which he complains that no one came round to see him anymore. They were all too frightened of Vincent. The only solution was to get him out of the flat by enrolling him in some kind of art school. Thus Vincent briefly became a pupil of the fashionably grotesque Parisian painter Fernand Cormon. Cormon specialised in Neanderthals, great hairy primitives acting out violent scenes from the Bible. This is Cain and his tribe fleeing after the murder of Abel. Horrible, isn't it? Cormon's studio was here on the Boulevard de Clichy at the bottom of the Montmartre hill. Cormon had a particular reputation for tolerance and seems to have had a nose for picking troublemakers. The head pupil in Cormon's studio, a kind of artistic prefect who was supposed to set the best example, was Toulouse-Lautrec. What an error of judgment that was on Cormon's part. Lautrec and Vincent became close. They'd go drinking and whoring together. And Lautrec produced a memorable pastel drawing of Vincent in a cafe much like this, staring thoughtfully into the distance, either because he had lots on his mind, or, more likely, because he'd been drinking too much of that absinthe in front of him and his elastic had snapped. Absinthe was the drug of choice in Montmartre. And you know how, when you pour some water into it, it turns a yellowy green. Well, they used to call it the Green Fairy, and Vincent liked it so much that he painted a still life of a glass of absinthe that feels almost like a loving portrait of it. The chief hallucinogenic ingredient of absinthe is called wormwood, which gets its name from the biblical story of Satan disguised as a snake hiding in the tree of knowledge and tempting Eve. A sensible man steers clear of absinthe, but Toulouse-Lautrec and Vincent van Gogh didn't or couldn't.
Madame Arthur de Paul de Cotte. Madame Arthur est une femme qui fit parler.
This is where a cafe called the Tambourine used to stand. It served delicious Italian food, served up by fetching wenches dressed in Italian peasant outfits. The tables were tambourine-shaped and presided over by the Tambourine's interesting owner, Agostina Segatori. She was from Naples originally, but came to Paris to be a model, and with her dark Neapolitan beauty, she made a passable Egyptian slave girl or Turkish harem wife in those absurd Orientalist fantasies that Cormon and his friends were producing. When Vincent encountered Agostina, she was in her late 40s, swarthy, a faded beauty, his kind of woman. He painted her in the corner of the Tambourin, dragging on a fag. Vincent and Agostina had some sort of affair. This is surely her, in the rather frantic and angrily sexy nudes that Vincent suddenly emerged with. It's not the Vincent we're used to. I don't know how good your geography of Paris is, but if you imagine the hill of Montmartre here with Sacré-Cœur on top, the River Seine flows along the front and then doubles back on itself in a sharp loop. So if you walk down from Montmartre Hill in this direction, you end up where I'm standing now, at Agné, the notorious riverside pleasure ground of the Impressionists. The Monets and the Renoirs made something terribly pretty out of Agné, but Vincent didn't. Vincent's Impressionism has a bleakness to it that no Frenchman would have sought out or admitted to. He used to walk here from Montmartre with a new pal, the painter Signac, who was a pointillist, a dot painter. They'd work around here all morning and then stop off for a late lunch on the way back. Vincent painted a couple of the restaurant interiors that he and Signac used to drop into, and they're done hilariously in the full dot manner that was all the rage that year. When you look at Van Gogh's Parisian output, it's like looking at a big box of samples. Shall I paint this way or that way? Shall I be an impressionist, or will I take up the dot and pointillise? Van Gogh produced 230 paintings in his 2 years in Paris, and hardly any of them seem alike. A certain Siegfried Bing had opened up an exotic Oriental emporium in the Rue de Provence, packed with imported Japanese goodies. Vincent was soon a regular visitor, and with Theo's money, he was buying in bulk. The brothers began manically collecting Japanese prints, hundreds and hundreds of them. Geishas, actresses, musicians, courtesans. On the left is a courtesan from Vincent's collection. On the right is an exact copy of her that Vincent did. It's slyly erotic, but then so was he. Here's another of these peculiar copies. Plum Trees in Flower, originally by Hiroshige. Vincent added some extra calligraphy to it. I've had it translated. It's an advertisement for a brothel called Yoshiwara's. And you know what? The Van Gogh Museum still has the tracing paper he used. Squared up, exact. Japanese prints changed Van Gogh's art as the sun coming up in the morning turns night into day, as they say around here. The great divide in his work is between his pre-Japan pictures and the post-Japan ones. His colours become clearer, brighter, the perspectives less Western. Shadows are banished, and a striking Japanese flatness enters his work. Vincent was so excited by his own Japanese prints that he organised a Montmartre exhibition at the Café Tambourin to show them off. You can just about make them out on the wall behind Agostina Segatori. The umbrella on her stool, that's definitely Japanese. It was probably bought at Bean's. A gift from Vincent, perhaps. This is Agostina too, after extreme Japanese surgery. Vincent fell out with her. Vincent fell out with everybody. Gay Paris nearly finished Vincent off and certainly ruined his health. He later complained that he'd become an alcoholic here. His nerves were shot from the constant arguments, the late nights, the absinthe, the bitching and the backstabbing. His fellow painters, he spat, disgusted him. Now, one of Van Gogh's more reliable character traits was a tendency to rush into decisions. Once he'd made his mind up to go away from somewhere, he was on the next train out. The departure from Paris was as abrupt as the arrival had been. As the train puffed out of Paris, all Vincent could think about, he wrote to Theo, was his arrival in Japan. He meant it as a befuddled metaphor, I suppose. Where he was really going was the town of Arles in the south of France. He stepped off the train on Monday, the 20th of February, 1888, to find Arles blanketed with snow. Who would have thought it? I spoke to a chap at our hotel who's lived here all his life, and he's only seen snow once. So this was truly exceptional weather. But Vincent was far too excited to let this unlikely snow dampen his enthusiasm. Besides, these were the only possible weather conditions that could make the south of France resemble Japan. A vague resemblance, perhaps, but a resemblance nevertheless. If you've never been here and you only know Arles through Vincent's art, which is how most people in the modern world first get to know it, then it's my duty to tell you that Arles is none of the things you think it is. When I first came here, I was expecting a sleepy and cute Provençal country town, surrounded by sunflowers and lavender, populated by kindly country folk, brown as nuts, because that's the image of the place Vincent has left us. But Arles isn't like that at all, and wasn't then. Vincent complained that it was a dirty town, surprisingly industrialised, the manufacturing centre of French rolling stock, trains, carriages, they were all made here. Look carefully at the horizons of his distant views of Arles, and you'll see as many belching factory chimneys as there are church steeples. Where there are factories and the railways, there's misery, and Arles had plenty of that. A few days after he arrived, Vincent was walking through here, the red light district of Arles in those days, when a commotion broke out outside a brothel. 2 Italians had murdered a pair of local soldiers, zouaves they were called, light infantrymen stationed in the town. Vincent took advantage of this murderous commotion and popped into the brothel himself. He became a frequent user, but as a result of this sensational double murder, every Italian in town was run out of Arles. Arles was good at running people out of town, as Vincent himself would later find out. But not just yet. While the snow was still on the ground, that marvellous weather-defying nut tree, the almond, was already blossoming. Vincent picked a branch, took it to his hotel, put it in a glass, and watched it so fondly. There was snow outside, but in his little room, spring had come. And soon, everything was in bloom in the orchards, and Vincent embarked upon an orgy of blossom painting. He produced 14 pictures in a few days,
pears, peaches, cherries, and he envisaged them hanging in threes to form triptychs, like religious pictures. Here at last was a religion he could give his all to once again, the religion of nature. You know, so many people come to Arles hoping to find the real Van Gogh. The trouble is, there's not much of the real Van Gogh left. What the good people of Arles didn't knock down, the Second World War bombers got rid of. However, if you really poke about and search hard, there are some places that come up as a little bit of a surprise. I mean, he did so much work when he was here, so many paintings, so many watercolours, so many drawings, that if you look around, you're bound to come across some of them again, like this beautiful little bridge here. One of the chief reasons Vincent had chosen to come to lowly Arles, out of all the places he could have gone to in the south of France, is because the town was famous for its women. Les Arlésiennes, they were called. They wore picturesque black costumes and were said to be the most beautiful women in France. Vincent was disappointed to find when he got here that the town wasn't overrun by beautiful Arlésiennes as he'd imagined. It's one of the first things he complains about. But just as he was to edit Arles itself to fit his mental image of it, so the proprietress of the cheap bar he'd found rooms in, Madame Januszczak she was called, was turned into the enticing Arlésienne of Vincent's imagination. This was a pub landlady who ran an all-night bar. But Vincent, who'd always had this thing about women in black, makes her noble and thoughtful. And if you line up all the women he ever yearned for in his life, you'll find a powerful family resemblance. Sad, dark women with much on their mind were Vincent's preferred type. Ever said anything happened between Vincent and Madame Januszczak, and I don't suppose it ever did. But this was his kind of woman. But look closely at the back of this compelling billiard scene he painted of Madame Januszczak's all-night bar. Isn't that her? Couldn't that be him? In the nights, Vincent drank. In the days, he painted. This was his preferred route out of Arles, the Tarascon Road. Vincent did a painting of himself striding into these fields. Unfortunately, it was destroyed in the Second World War. Perhaps the greatest loss there's been in Van Gogh's art. It's such a poignant image of him, troping off to work like a peasant farmer. I really wish I could show you the real thing. But at least we've got this. Someone had the wit to take a photograph before it was burnt. Vincent in his splattered blue overalls and straw hat, lugging around his painting gear like a porter at Paddington Station. As he trudged along these roads in this heat, weighed down with all sorts of painters' luggage, it's not surprising that Vincent started to look for ways of losing some of that luggage. In any case, he was running out of paint and canvas because he was so alarmingly prolific. But with a typical piece of Vincent ingenuity, he soon found a new way to work outdoors. Luckily for him, the roadsides of Arles are overgrown with these things, the Camargue reed. Now Vincent knew that Rembrandt had used reeds and made great works with them. The thing is, they're absolutely everywhere. They're free, plentiful, and they're terribly easy to turn into pens.
All you need is a knife, a decent stout reed, and look at that. It sharpens up so beautifully into a lovely point. And they're surprisingly versatile. When you look at Vincent's drawings, the reed drawings he did here, all that stippling, the dots, the lines, they really do represent the hay fallen over, the harvest growing, the trees blossoming. He really was so masterful with this. And I think there's something very fitting about the fact that this stuff gathered from nature's bounty should have been responsible for so many of his most delicate Arles pictures. So light to carry around, so easy. There you go.
This is Montmajour, a complex of medieval ruins on a hill from which there are splendid views to be had of Arles in the distance with the plain of La Crau in between. Vincent produced one of his finest reed pen drawings from this viewpoint. He walked here a considerable journey from Arles with his soldier friend, Second Lieutenant Millier, the Zouave, to whom Vincent was now giving drawing lessons. Reed pen is black and white, of course, but when the two of them looked down at this great vista, they must have noted how yellow it was. The harvesters, the wheat fields. And in this golden sea, some particularly vivid patches of yellow would have stood out. It's just a cheap cash crop around here, grown in bulk to make cooking oil for frying sausages. But by the time Vincent van Gogh had done with it, this cheap yellow cash crop would have been transformed into the most famous flower ever painted.
When I was a boy, my mother took out a subscription for me to a magazine called Knowledge. I don't know if you remember it. Knowledge used to have full-page reproductions in it of famous paintings. And the first one I remember cutting out and sticking to my wall was Van Gogh's Night Cafe in the Place du Forum. I suppose its sense of nocturnal, urban alienation chimed with mine, or something awful like that. But take away a few thousand tourists, drop the prices massively, and it's unchanged. Van Gogh wasn't the only troublemaker in Arles in the summer of 1888. The town was also home to a garrison of lurid French soldiers called Zouaves. These exotic Zouaves had started out as Algerian warriors. The silly uniform was based on Algerian tribal wear. Red fezzes, voluminous red pantaloons, and these pretty embroidered waistcoats. It's ridiculous gear for a soldier. Well, these Zouaves were stationed here, where the police station is now. This was an important base for them, and where there are soldiers, there are women, drink, trouble. People in Arles had an expression, acting the Zouave. It meant being flash, cocky, lippy. Vincent's first friend in Arles, his first drinking buddy, was an officer in the Zouaves, Second Lieutenant Millier. This Millier would go to the brothel before important army exams to put himself in the right frame of mind. Vincent was mightily impressed. It's a talent he wished he had. Very little is ever said about Vincent's sexual instincts, which were powerful and coarse. His friend Gauguin, who was soon to join him here in Arles, with disastrous consequences, is always being accused of beastly sexual behaviour. But Vincent has somehow avoided this condemnation. We think of him as an eccentric elder brother, turbulent perhaps, but essentially safe and kindly. Of course he was kind, but there was a dangerous and sexually explosive side to him, and unless we accept this, we can't begin to understand what may have happened to him here in Arles when Vincent's elastic snapped. All the time he was here, he was a manic brothel goer. When the good people of Arles finally chucked him out, the petitioning women accused him of molesting them. We don't want to believe it. It doesn't fit our cosy fantasies about Vincent. In our imaginations, he's been neutered. He's the artist as the friendly family pet. There's a painting he did here that's so significant. It's of a girl. She's 13 or 14. He called it the Mousme. He'd been reading this atrocious book about Japan, Madame Chrysanthème by Pierre Loti. A typically sexist outpouring of Western drivel about Japanese women. In this book, the Mousmes were 13-year-old girls who'd be temporarily married to visiting Westerners. Vincent thrilled at this idea. His painting seeks to evoke these illicit desires. See what the Mousme's holding in her hand. It's a sprig of oleander, a local blossom that's poisonous to touch and whose aroma can be fatal. There were stories going round among the Zouaves of soldiers in Algeria who'd built themselves temporary huts with roofs of oleander. They'd all died in the night. Vincent's Mousme, that sweet-looking little girl, is a dangerous temptation. Why am I going on about this? Because Vincent had some sort of sexual crisis here in Arles. He wrote to Theo that he could no longer get it up, as he put it so bluntly. He was as impotent as a character in a Guy de Maupassant story. Of course he was impotent. He was drinking too much. But the effects of this impotence have been underrated, yet it explains so much. The explosive atmosphere of his night scenes, the taunting and constant presence of happy couples in his pictures. The crisis Vincent had here had powerful sexual fuel thrown onto it. The night had always fascinated him, and he'd harboured an ambition to paint it for a long time. The night, he wrote, is more coloured than the day. He painted a magical view from just here, his first starry night. Painting at night, of course, is impossible, so Vincent apparently stuck some candles to the rim of his straw hat, and they threw out just enough flicker for him to paint the stars. If I had to choose one of the letters Vincent wrote from Arles as the most revealing, it would be the one he sent to Theo in July about stars. He said looking up at the night sky from here and seeing the stars was like opening up a strange map and seeing all those black dots representing faraway towns and places. And just as you had to take a train to reach one of these faraway places, so to reach the stars, you had to die. It seems to me, he writes, that cholera and cancer are the celestial means of locomotion, just as steamboats, omnibuses and railways are the terrestrial means. To die quietly of old age would be to go there on foot. This is the same letter in which he admits to being impotent. I've been racking my brains trying to think of an artist's house that's more famous than this one, and you know, I can't. This, the Yellow House in Arles, is surely the most celebrated artistic abode there's ever been. It's the only house Vincent called his own, but that's not the chief reason for its notoriety. It's notorious because, remarkably, Gauguin lived here too. Look at it, it's tiny, yet somehow two huge artistic egos squashed themselves into there simultaneously. It was never going to work, was it?
Vincent, rather pathetically, had been trying to get anyone, to come and live with him in Arles. He was lonely, he needed artistic company. He tried Toulouse-Lautrec, who never wrote back. But above all, he pestered Gauguin, over and over and over again.
Gauguin came here chiefly for financial reasons. He was basically blackmailed into it by Theo, who offered to support him if only he'd join Vincent in Arles. Gauguin complained bitterly that he was being asked to prostitute himself, but he did it anyway.
To welcome his notoriously argumentative painter buddy, Vincent decided to decorate the yellow house with pictures of a flower he'd grown fond of that was grown locally in bulk for cooking oil. Vincent's plan was to produce a dozen of these flower paintings and to hang them in the guest bedroom, one next to the other, in homemade orange frames.
If someone's coming to stay with you, it's normal, isn't it, to put a bunch of flowers in the room? Welcome your guest. What isn't so normal is to fill this room with relentless and hallucinatory expanses of raw yellow. The sunflowers are seen, rightly I think, as disguised self-portraits. Their famous behaviour, that magical way they always turn to face the sun, makes every sunflower a botanical Vincent. Vincent had already painted sunflowers back in Paris. People used to grow them in Montmartre, outside their cottages, great big tall things, leaning over the fence like a nosy neighbour. In Provence, however, the sunflowers don't come in singles, they come in oceans, unbelievable expanses of the fiercest yellow. It's still a sight that makes you dizzy. He got up at dawn, came into these fields, collected 10, 15 flowers, took them home, put them in the vase and painted them till they wilted. All the time he'd be drinking extra strong coffee, deliberately overstimulating himself, getting himself on a caffeine high so he could reach what he called that high note of yellow, like a singer straining to reach that difficult top C. When Gauguin finally walked into his new room in Arles, his bedroom, and saw these things, can you imagine how uncomfortable it must have made him? It's like Mozart going round to Beethoven's and being forced to listen to the Fifth Symphony all day and all night. If you'd been Gauguin, you would have done what he did, taken them off the walls and put up something a tad more neutral. I apologise for the fact that we can only show you this underwhelming model of it, but the Allies bombed it successfully in 1944 and completely destroyed the Yellow House in Arles. That's Vincent's room on the right. God, it's so familiar from that cosy and delightful painting of it that he did. There's Gauguin's bedroom on the left, filled with sunflowers. See how small it is, much smaller than Vincent's room on the right, which Gauguin would have noticed. Gauguin arrived on the 22nd of October, 1888. He only lived here with Vincent for 63 days. The two of them should never have squashed themselves into this tiny place. But they did, and what wonders they produced. Vincent's chair and Gauguin's chair, both by Vincent. Gauguin. The Postman's Wife by Gauguin. The Postman's Wife and the Postman's Baby by Vincent. And there's the baby again by Vincent. Until recently, no one knew that Vincent had painted Gauguin. Then this turned up, a sneak view from the back. The single most prominent structure in Arles, the one building you really can't miss in the town, is the Bull Ring, the old Roman arena where Arles would stage its famous corridas.
Vincent liked the bullfights, so did Gauguin. There's a Vincent painting of a crowd much like this. Come to see the bloodletting. The painting was done in December. It was probably a small pre-Christmas corrida to which Gauguin and Vincent came together. The corrida would have been a welcome relief from the arguing and the boozing. Tensions in the Yellow House were growing impossible. When a matador has fought particularly well against a bull, the custom here is to present this victorious matador with the bull's ear. They just cut it off and give it to him. It's a gory celebration of the bull's defeat and the matador's victory. On the night before Christmas Eve, 1888, Vincent approached Gauguin in the street and threatened him with a razor. Gauguin, as he remembered it, stared him down, and Vincent slunk off into the night. It was only the next day that they found out he'd taken his shaving razor. You can just about make it out in that charming interior of his bedroom by the washing bowl. He grabbed his ear here, and starting from the top in front of a mirror, I imagine, slashed down through the ear with the razor, cutting most of it off and severing an artery. He started bleeding profusely. Then he wrapped the piece of flesh he'd cut off in a newspaper and took it to the brothel, where he presented it to his favourite whore, Rachel. Everyone screamed. Fortunately, Roulon, the old postman, was at the brothel at the time, and he took Vincent home. The police were called. They arrived at the Yellow House to find it dripping with Vincent's blood. He was nearly dead. We'll never know exactly what happened between Gauguin and Vincent. I'm pretty sure it was something to do with women. Gauguin was successful with them, Vincent wasn't. In this public arena, the defeated bull has its ear cut off when it loses. In the private arena of the Yellow House, Vincent did his own ear cutting.
Gauguin had been threatening to leave for weeks. The day after Vincent slashed himself, he was gone and never saw Vincent again.
This was the hospital in Arles to which the bleeding Vincent was brought to heal up. He couldn't remember anything that had happened to him. It was, and is, a most mysterious collapse. He was lucky, though, with his physician, Dr. Ray, a young and sympathetic inhabitant of Arles, though not, alas, a lover of modern art. Vincent did a portrait of him, which the doctor's family used infamously to board up their chicken coop. When he was well enough to paint again, they let him out, and he produced that poignant and haunted self-portrait with the bandaged ear. Theo had asked a local vicar to look after him. There was another attack.
a raving Vincent thought the good people of Arles were trying to poison him, which they probably would have done given the chance. If he went out in the streets, the kids would chuck things at him, cabbage stalks, rotten fruit. This dishevelled figure with the fur hat and the bandage howling back at his tormentors. It was too much for the good people of Arles. 30 of them got together a petition and brought it here to the town hall, insisting that the painter Van Gogh be put away. He was a menace to society, a drunk and a molester of women. That petition is still in the archives of Arles.
This is it. This is the petition that the good citizens of Arles drew up and handed in to their mayor, asking for Vincent to be put away somewhere. Monsieur le Maire, dear Mayor, it says, we, the undersigned, would like to point out to you that this Dutch painter, Vincent, in brackets, has lost some of his mental faculties and also drinks too much. And when he drinks too much, he's an annoyance to the women and the children. And it's signed by all the people who got together and asked the mayor to ensure that Vincent was put away.
Something had to be done before Vincent was lynched. It was the Protestant vicar, Sales, whom Theo had asked to keep an eye on Vincent, who recommended this asylum at Saint-Remy, 15 or so miles from Arles. Saint Paul de Mozol it was called. It had a reputation for progressiveness, and Vincent voluntarily checked himself in here on the 8th of May, 1889. Saint-Remy is renowned for two things. One is that Nostradamus, that celebrated predictor of human doom, was born here. The other is that Vincent, that unpredictable painter of human hope, was locked up here for a year. He produced 150 paintings, but he only signed 7 of them. This was a period of transience, uncertainty, and flux. By an eerie coincidence, the asylum in Saint-Remy, like the one in Arles, was a former monastery, 12th century Augustine, with a cloister that's also reminiscent of Arles. It's a space for walking round and round and round in circles, thinking. There's a powerful sense here of an enclosed society, a private world within these walls. These monkish atmospheres quickly infiltrated Vincent's art. The first painting he did here was those swirling irises that now hang somewhat perversely in the Grand Getty Museum in Los Angeles. What a clash of spirits that is between here and there. Vincent's irises, humble wayside flowers that come out all through the fields here at Easter time, have long ago been roped into symbolizing the end of the winter in Provençal folklore and resurrection. All those blue irises in the painting and just one white one standing out against the crowd. I wonder who that represents. These enclosed gardens of Saint-Remy became Vincent's private little world, his cosmos. His art began paying such minuscule attention to everything in here, the butterflies, the beetles, the irises and the roses. One night he found a huge moth in the garden and had cruelly to kill it in order to paint it. He said it was a death head moth, but that's just wishful thinking on Vincent's part and bad lepidoptery. It was an emperor moth, and they should change the label at the Van Gogh Museum immediately. Whatever it was, it has about it that Japanese sense of the cosmos being represented in every blade of grass, every moth, every beetle. In this enclosed garden, this monastic greenhouse, the mysticism inside him was growing fierce again. But you'll want to know about his so-called madness. We're coming to that.
This is Vincent's cell, or one just like it. Many of the paintings he produced here at Saint-Remy were views done just through there, though he never painted the bars. When he looked out through the window, he saw a reaper down there, cutting through the corn in the field outside. He'd painted reapers before, but never with this much ecstatic yellow energy. He said this reaper was an image of death scything through the corn, representing us, of course. Yet the mood of the picture is so manically positive. Death with a smile on its face, he wrote.
What he couldn't escape, of course, was his own sense of imprisonment. This wall he looked down on from his window, repeated in picture after picture, is a stubborn mantra. It's only the wall of the garden, but it seems so sternly to mark the limits of his freedom. So what was actually wrong with him? The short answer is that no one really knows. If you squeezed 100 psychologists into this tiny cell and asked them to diagnose Vincent, you'd get 100 different answers. The latest contribution to this popular psychiatric pastime of analysing Vincent comes from the chief psychologist here at Saint-Remy, Dr. Jean-Marc Boulon.
Alors je pense que les circonstances de l'hospitalisation de Van Gogh sont très particulières dans la mesure où c'est une charnière, un virage dans sa vie, puisque toute sa vie c'est un homme qui a été rejeté. Rejeté par rapport au milieu religieux, rejeté par les femmes, rejeté par la ville d'Arles, et enfin, donc on peut penser que les attaques qu'il a à l'époque de Gauguin, enfin dans cette zone-là, ressemblent à des crises d'épilepsie, en particulier des épilepsies temporales. Maintenant, la problématique de la maladie épileptique, et je vous disais plusieurs diagnostics, qui est associée à une autre maladie que nous appelons le trouble bipolaire, c'est-à-dire c'est une maladie qui est caractérisée par des oscillations de l'humeur, des très hauts et des très bas. Cette maladie s'appelle la psychose maniaco-dépressive, ou on l'appelle maintenant aussi trouble bipolaire.
Did you get that? Manic depression with epilepsy thrown in. At least the syphilis seems to have faded. In Vincent's time, the chief cure here for all of them, indeed for everything, was a long soak. I have this image of Vincent in his grave, laughing himself silly at the confusion he's caused in the ranks of our brain specialists. The very first diagnosis of his illness from the head doctor here at Saint-Remy, Dr. Peyron, was that Vincent was suffering from epilepsy, pure and simple, which of course meant there could be more attacks.
The good thing about being diagnosed as an epileptic is that it presupposes that you'll have these long periods of rational and reasonable behaviour in between the attacks. So they let him out. He started walking around the local countryside, exploring it. It's one of the first places he came. This spooky ravine. There have been quarries here, apparently, since Greek times. They'd formed these spectacular caverns. He had a
a young assistant with him who was delegated to look after Vincent on these walks through the countryside. Vincent found him a bit annoying. One time they came back from painting the ravine, and they were going up the stairs in the asylum, and Vincent just suddenly turned round and kicked this man right in the stomach. Why? People said again it was a sign of madness, but I think he did it under cover of madness, just getting his own back for being bossed around. I think this is the ravine where Vincent had the first of his Saint-Remy attacks. He was painting the view through there when it came on, a dizziness, a storm. He managed to stumble back to the asylum where he tried to poison himself by eating his paints. It all lasted about a week. When he recovered, he described to Theo with interesting shame his blurred memories of singing hymns and ranting superstitiously about God, and he despised what he called this absurd religious aspect of his mind storms. And he blamed the gloomy, monkish surroundings of the asylum for it, but the mind storms came from him, not from them. The timing of Vincent's attacks is, I suggest, highly revealing. The first one, back in Arles, came when Gauguin threatened to leave the Yellow House. Then, when Theo announced he was going to marry, Vincent had a relapse. Here in Saint-Remy, Theo's new wife, Jo, wrote to tell Vincent that she was pregnant, and he had that attack by this ravine. For most people, a baby in the family triggers uncomplicated joy. But for Vincent, needy, selfish, aggressive, willful Vincent, who'd been chronically dependent on Theo for most of his adult life, the new baby was a threat. Look at these incidents together and you have a pattern. Vincent's attacks came at moments of perceived rejection, when he felt left out, when the fear of being alone unbalanced him. The landscape around the asylum was conspicuously different from Arles, which is only such a little way away. The cypresses, for instance, were bigger, more prominent. They're supposed to be the tree of death, of course, and around here they grow them in the cemeteries. But Vincent's cypresses aren't in the least bit melancholy or hushed. They're great, burly, ecstatic trees writhing up to the heavens. Egyptian obelisks, he called them. He found their struggle to reach the stars inspirational. And it was here that Vincent painted his second great Starry Night. That celestial orchestra of astral Catherine wheels spinning through the heavens, playing Wagner in the sky. One of the key constituents of the Vincent myth is the belief that he never had any success in his life. He only sold one picture, he was always misunderstood, etc., etc. It's true, he did only sell one picture. It happened while he was here at Saint-Remy. One of his Arles vineyards was sold in Brussels for 400 francs. But what was it doing in Brussels? It was part of an important display of French avant-garde painting. Theo had put his work into the Salon de Refusés. Monet said they were the best things in the show. A Dutch reviewer went into ecstasies about how important Vincent was. Who will save modern art, he asked. Vincent was his reply. Van Gogh wasn't discovered after he died. He was discovered while he was here, locked up in Saint-Remy. But it gave him so little pleasure. There's a Polish expression for which I can't quite think of an exact English translation. Zbrzydziło mu się. It means to go off something, to develop a revulsion for it. Zbrzydziło mu się. Whatever the right translation is, something of this order happened to Vincent's feelings about Saint-Remy and the south of France. Put most simply, he was homesick for the warm and cosy fires of his dark Dutch childhood, the low black cottages, the hard-working country folk. So he went back to visit them, not in the flesh, silly, but in his art, pitching a lift up north on other people's pictures. These obsessive reworkings of other artists' pictures aren't really copies. He did them from black and white prints that Theo sent him. They're ambitious reimaginings in colour, starting from scratch almost, and I think they're some of his most exciting paintings. But their psychological meaning, the darker stuff, only becomes clearer when you consider his situation. He was desperate to get away from Saint-Remy, away from the asylum, away from that maddening sun, away from the south of France, back among his potato eaters, back in the gloom, back home, if you like, in the northern stretches of his imagination. And among these northern reworkings is Vincent's version of an old print by Gustave Doré he'd collected in London, of the inmates at Newgate Prison marching round in circles. Many now consider Vincent's version of this London jail scene to be the archetypal image of his imprisonment at Saint-Remy. We need also to consider this humble stuff, ivy. From the time he was a boy running around those woods in Zundert, ivy had always been Vincent's favourite plant, his horticultural alter ego. It stood for him, the way it clings, its dependence on others, its fierce survival instincts, and its fondness for gloomy forest floors. As a boy, he'd drawn it and collected it, and now, in the scruffy gardens of Saint-Remy, he sought it out again and painted it so very symbolically. The sunflower madness, you sense, was over. Vincent had become an ivy man again. I have a terrible craving, he wrote to Theo, to see my friends again, and the countryside of the north. He bullied Theo into letting him abandon the asylum. The doctor, signing him out, wrote one word in the hospital log: cured. It was wishful thinking. Since no one could be found to take him up to Paris, Vincent set off on his own on the overnight train. He got there safely enough and spent a couple of days with Theo and Theo's wife Jo and their new baby Vincent Willem, named after him of course. But it was all too much, and he couldn't bear to be separated from his paint box. And so, on the 20th of May, 1890, Vincent's train pulled up here at his final village. Auvers, about 20 miles north of Paris, was and is a pretty place that attracted artists. The Impressionists came here, Barbizon painters, and now Vincent too. It had been arranged that Vincent was to be looked after by a Dr. Paul Gachet, an art-loving medical man and friend of the Impressionists whose special interest was the creative mind. Gachet lived here in what had been a girls' boarding school. 3 days a week, he'd commute to Paris where he had consulting rooms. His diagnosis of Vincent was that there was nothing wrong with him. All Vincent needed was a good rest. Gachet was, and I'm putting this kindly, eccentric in his medical approach, and his remedy for heart problems was to administer digitalis, the essence of foxgloves from which they make absinthe around here. And Gachet was himself a sufferer from what Winston Churchill used to call that black dog, depression. If I were ill in any serious way, I wouldn't have gone near this man. A scared Vincent wrote back to Theo, "Gachet is sicker than I am." This is Dr. Gachet's salon. Gachet was a widower. He had 2 children, a boy who was 17, Paul, and a daughter who was 21, Marguerite. Apparently, Vincent could have stayed in this house. There was room, but Dr. Gachet was nervous of having his beautiful daughter so close to Vincent. Nevertheless, Vincent painted her. He did a lovely picture of her out there in the garden just there, with a view of Auvers behind her. And, most famously, he painted her playing the piano. This piano. He used one of those canvases that were his Auvers speciality, the very long, low ones. Normally he used them for his landscapes. He painted the cornfields on those. But for Marguerite at the piano, he also used one and tipped it up, so she's seen playing the piano long ways. One of the most famous pictures that Vincent painted in Auvers is of the church, which, until you get here, it's not obvious, but it's actually at the top of the hill overlooking the village. And it's also, strangely, one of his most detailed pictures. If you look at the church, it hasn't really changed at all from the time he was here. And he must have sat there all day looking ever so carefully. For example, the tracery around the windows, it's exactly as it is on the church. There's a few bits which I rather enjoy, where he's obviously really just skipped over the details. He couldn't be bothered to do them properly. For example, there are these corbels above the window, and in the real church there are a row of lovely gargoyles which he's just flattened off, squared off. He couldn't be bothered to do them. But the greatest thing he did, I think, is to take this simple, relatively small parish church and to turn it in his painting into this great soaring cathedral. One thing you'd never know from looking at Vincent's picture is how small this place is. Auvers has an interesting topography which is worth understanding to get a sense of what Vincent painted here. It's a long, thin village that basically follows the river Oise along its valley and then climbs up the valley's sides in these higgledy-piggledy clusters of cottages built steeply up the hill until you get to the top where, if you're a Van Gogh admirer, a most thrilling sight awaits you. It's a huge, flat, stretching plateau, an elevated plain, a mini America almost, of long, low, endless wheat fields. When you come up the hill from the village past the church and into these giant fields, there's an immediate change of scale, from higgledy-piggledy to vast, from those cramped village streets below to these daunting open spaces. It makes you want to breathe. Thus Vincent's art from Auvers also alternates energetically between the claustrophobic cottages below and those great plains above. You know, Vincent was only in Auvers for 69 days, the final 69 days of his life.
But in those 69 days, he managed to produce 80 paintings and the usual cluster of watercolours, gouaches, drawings. Most of the time, he was clearly enjoying himself and working like a man possessed. But just as it was all going so well, disaster struck. For you and me, I don't think it would have been a disaster. All that happened was that Theo and his wife Jo decided to take their new baby to Holland for the summer instead of coming here to Auvers and visiting Vincent as Vincent had hoped. A minor disappointment, you would have thought, but for Vincent, it added up to a major betrayal. He flipped. His letters to Theo got nasty, he picked a fight with Gachet and stopped going round there. Now, I'm no psychiatrist, but even I can see that here was a man deliberately engineering his own isolation in order to prove that no one wanted him.
Back here at his lodgings, his landlord Ravu didn't notice any obvious change in his wayward artistic lodger. Vincent got up at 5 in the morning as he always did, went out to paint the fields all day as he always did, came back at nightfall, ate his supper and was in bed by 9 as he always was.
On July the 27th, 1890, Vincent wolfed down his lunch more quickly than usual and set off up here at the back of the village. This is the wall that runs behind the village chateau. You can see it in a couple of his paintings. Up here, you're pretty much hidden from the rest of the village. No one can see what you're doing. Vincent took out a revolver he'd got his hands on somewhere. The locals, trying to cover themselves, I think, said later it was the gun he used for frightening the crows. But why would Vincent want to frighten the crows? He shot himself around here, aiming vaguely at his heart. But it wasn't much of a gun by all accounts, and the bullet never made it out the other side.
Vincent fainted, but he wasn't dead. A few hours later, he stumbled back down the hill and, saying nothing to anybody, made his way to his bed at the Auberge Ravu.
The innkeeper followed him up to his room, this room. He sent for the village doctor, a Dr. Mazaret. Vincent insisted that Gachet come as well. So these two profoundly inappropriate sawbones, a village doctor who specialised in midwifery, and Gachet, who cured his patients by giving them foxgloves for their heart disease, inspected Vincent together and together agreed that the best thing to do was to leave him as he was. Had it happened to him today, he would have been operated on immediately and probably saved. It wasn't until the next day that Theo was notified. He rushed onto the first train and got here to find Vincent sitting up in bed at first, puffing away at his pipe. Theo cradled him in his arms, and as the hours ticked by, he could feel Vincent slipping away. At 1:30 in the morning, on Tuesday, the 29th of July, 1890, still in Theo's arms, Vincent went.
Gachet did a drawing of him on his deathbed on a paper napkin from the Auberge Ravu. Vincent was 37. He'd been an artist for just 9 years. Because Vincent was a suicide, the Catholic priest refused to allow his hearse to be used or for a church service to be held. The man who made Vincent's stretchers for him built the coffin. The tragedy doesn't stop there either. Just 6 months after Vincent died, Theo, of all people, followed him into the grave. He'd been behaving most strangely for some months. Violent outbursts, rants, collapses. At the time, this unexpected descent into madness was blamed on a mysterious liver condition. It was only much, much later that the Van Gogh family finally admitted that it was syphilis. It was Theo's wife, Jo, who planted this symbolic ivy on their graves. This Jo was to do so much for Vincent. She became the tireless promoter of his work and eventually made him famous. But it's for planting this ivy here that I want to thank her now. It came from Dr. Gachet's garden. She said it was meant to symbolise Vincent and Theo clinging together even in death. But it does more than that, I think. On this grave, that ivy is a touching monument to the real Vincent. This ivy, not those infernally popular sunflowers, was his favourite plant. It clings, it needs the damp, and above all, it's of the north. Vincent was that too. Had he lived longer, I'm certain he would have gone back to Holland and returned to the dark Dutch taproot of his childhood. Auvers wasn't meant to be his last stop. It was meant to be a staging post on Vincent's journey back home.